Silence. Okay. Thanks all for making the effort to come out today. I know the heat is a bit testing, but I would really appreciate you coming. And I want to begin by thanking the Institute for Policy Research, and especially Amy, for all the work that she's done on this, put this event together. This event is hosted by the Institute of Policy Research and also the Centre for the Study of Violence. I was trying to think back when I was doing this introduction, when I first met Phil, and I think I recall receiving an email from you about 10 years ago, and it was saying something around something I'd wrote, and then I remember looking up your name and going, bloody hell, this is serious. And I was overwhelmed by the generosity you showed to me at that time. And then I was just thinking about all the wonderful conversations we've had since, and meeting up with you in Belfast, and I kind of think there's a joke in there, a Welshman and a Scouser in Belfast. But I don't know where that would go. But I think often when we're asked to give introductions, we tend to focus on professional qualifications and achievements, institutional standings, and the impact of our research. Now, our speaker today could boast all of these in absolute abundance. However, I think where he stands out is somewhat immeasurable. How do you do justice in an introduction like this to a life spent dedicated to the tireless fight for justice for others? Like many boys of my age, I grew up supporting Liverpool FC. At the time, who wants to support a losing team, right? So I supported Liverpool FC. And anybody who knows the history of that club will know how it has been marked by a tragedy, which was doubled by the tragedy of injustice. Yet the story of Hillsborough cannot be separated from the dignity and dedication of our guest this evening, Phil Scraton. Now, in a remarkable ceremony held in 2016, the 96 victims of the disaster, which is now 97, were posthumously given the freedom of the city of Liverpool. On that same day, Phil was also bestowed with such an honour and recognition of the crucial support he gave to the grieving families. I believe that is the kind of impact our work should be aspiring to achieve. Now, Phil is Professor Emeritus at the School of Law in Queen's University Belfast and has held visiting professorships at Sydney, Australia, New Zealand and Amherst, USA. He holds a Leverhulme Research Fellowship. His 17 books are a must-read and include Law, Order and the Authoritarian State, Childhood in Crisis, Power, Conflict and Criminalization, The Violence of Incarceration, Hillsborough, The Truth, and also a work in progress which is forthcoming on childhood, transition and justice. He was the primary author of the Hillsborough Independent Panel's groundbreaking report, Hillsborough 2012. And Phil has also co-authored pioneering research into the circumstances of the 1976-81 H-Block and Armagh prison protests, the experience of victims and survivors of the mother-baby home scandal, otherwise known as the Magdalene Laundry scandals, and more recently the police brutality at the 2022 Paris European Champions League final. Now, the title for Phil's talk today is Bearing Witness to the Pain of Others, which will no doubt draw upon his wealth of experience and battles in the fight for local and global justice. I could spend another 15 minutes talking about the further accolades that Phil has done, but I think time is better spent listening to Phil himself. So if you please welcome me and welcome in this evening, Professor Phil Scraton.
Thank you so much for such a warm introduction, Brad. And it's a great privilege to be here, not only because I'm an admirer and fan of Brad's work, but also to be surrounded by Chantal's work, which is on the walls in here and is on the walls outside. And I urge you all to spend some time when we finish going around that work and talking to her. I had the privilege of having an individual conducted tour for an hour this afternoon. Absolutely outstanding work. And I'm in awe of that. I didn't really know how I was going to approach today. And I'm also talking tomorrow in Oxford, so I've run the two sessions more or less in parallel, but they're different in part. You'll recognize this photograph. I'm not a poet, but I have moments of words. And all I could sum up at this moment was, as the sea withdrew on its twice daily ebb, golden Mediterranean sands speckled with washed-up cargo, not for bounty hunters nor trophy seekers. From this well, but body bags and unmarked graves. From this well of suffering and fractured lives, politicians seized a callous opportunity. That spoke to me, that moment spoke to me, as being defining, and ever since, in the Channel and in other places, but also now in Gaza, throughout the world, in the place I live, the north of Ireland. That seizing of callous opportunity is so significant. Susan Sontag asks what is a profound question. What to do with such knowledge of faraway suffering? It seems normal for people to ignore the ordeals of others. We don't get it. We truly can't imagine how dreadful, how terrifying, and how normal it becomes. Can't understand, can't imagine. I see that as partly my job. And many of you will be familiar with the word that became so popular in social science, in social legal studies. The word that was used was othering. But of course, the other has a history. Simone de Beauvoir was so quite clear about this in The Second Sex. Humanity is male. A man defines woman not in herself, but as relative to him. She is not regarded as an autonomous being. She is defined and differentiated with reference to man, and not he with reference to her. She is the incidental, the inessential, as opposed to the essential. He is the subject. He is the absolute. She is the other. And so many of you are familiar with this paragraph. But what follows, incidentally, it's over the page, is that others included blacks in the USA, indigenous people in the colonies, proletarians within capitalist economies, and women and girls throughout patriarchies. The other, I think, in the way it's constructed, has defined much of the work that I do. Also, early on in my work, I was introduced to Howard Becker. And Howard Becker used this statement when in his presidential address to an annual meeting of the Society for the Study of Social Problems. A fairly right-wing society at the time that thought of itself as becoming progressive. He said that contemporary sociologists, studying problems that have relevance to the world we live in, are caught in the crossfire. To have values or not to have values. It was not possible, he said, to do research uncontaminated by personal and public sympathies. The question was not whether we should take sides, but whose side are we on? And studying sociology at university in the early 70s, I can honestly say that it never struck many of the people that taught us that we were caught in the crossfire. We were taught that we should study and work together to produce value-free sociology. Social research should get into the situation enough to have a perspective on it, to challenge institutional and professional discourses. Believe it or not, reading Howard Becker all that time ago, I've since met him and thanked him because his work, The Outsiders, changed my life. Social research is obviously political. It can't be anything but. Power, whether it's class, gender, sexuality, racism, in the society in which I live, sectarianism. Honouring the uniqueness, there's an A missing out of research. Honouring the uniqueness of lives and experiences of others. Ensuring the view from below inside is heard. What do I mean by the view from below inside? That reflects my work on prisons. That view is marginalized, so often not heard. So the view from below is not a hierarchical issue. It's the reality of exclusion. It's about valuing difference, strengthening resistance. It's about encouraging and valuing what Frigga Haug calls memory work. How we do that work that brings to life the long history and the short history that we experience. Mobilizing personal and collective agency. Agency which has become a much maligned word. But if agency means anything, it can be about the collectivization of our experiences and the mobilization of that. For we, everyone in this room, are the agents of conflict, and we are the agents of change. And that has always driven my work, it's always been underpinning my work, to make a choice between whether me and my research in the university or outside aligns with conflict or attempts to develop a dialogue around change. What do I mean by knowing? How do we know what we know? One of the great Australian sociologists, flying from, well, he's from New Zealand actually, but he's working in Australia, and he goes to the Northern Territories, and he arrives in a community where he sees broken lives, where he experiences the marginalization face on. And somebody says to him, if you think this is bad, go down to the local police station. He goes down. He walks into the police station, and in the police station are two children in tattered clothes, a piss-ridden mattress on the floor, broken glass everywhere. And he says to the station sergeant, what on earth are these children doing here? Oh, they've been sent to us. It often happens. They've been sent to us as a punishment. They were uncontrollable in class. That gave rise to his work, and he raised that question, why weren't we told? Reading those sort of stories, addressing those issues, made me really question how much of my own historical relationship with sociology and politics in my university, in the university where I went, Liverpool, how much information is truly reliable? What do we mean by science? What do we mean by scientific analysis? And immediately, these issues, along with the research I was doing, particularly the research at the time with the gypsy and travelling community in Liverpool, were the relationships of power, underpinned by ideology, and how power is ideologically constructed as well as materially constructed, and how that creates what Foucault calls regimes of truth. We could have a whole session just on regimes of truth, but I haven't got time for that. But that became a guiding mantra. And what John Berger, in a book on art, talks about ways of seeing. If we go outside now and we look at Chantal's exhibition, or in here, we will all see something different, particularly if it's abstract. We'll all bring to each work of art a way of seeing, a way of interpretation. We don't need to be told what it's about, because we will make sense of that for ourselves. And John Berger was saying ways of seeing about interpretation. And who is to invalidate a way of seeing? Sociologists, political scientists, in my experience. We're invalidating, through intellectual collusion, so much of what was happening around me, so much of what was happening in my community. And at that time, it was Liverpool 8, Toxteth. And that convinced me that underpinning the work we do has to be an understanding of dissenting accounts, trying to create alternative discourses. And at that same time, I was teaching an evening class in Walton Prison, mainly with lifers. And I would come out of that class, I would talk to people about the experience. And they would immediately try to invalidate it. If I talked about the shit detail, where they were 3 to a cell, no toilet, they were wrapping their excrement up in newspaper and tossing it out of the window. And in the morning, a guy would go around with a wheelbarrow, shovel it all up. I said, that was the experience of prison. And they'd say, how do you know that? Because I saw it with my own eyes. And that simplistic explanation is about being there in order to bear witness. And that became the underpinning of my work and what I really mean by knowing. Because there, I could see the cases. They were staring me in the face. I was working on them. I knew exactly what they were, whether it was with the police, whether it was with prisons, whoever I was working with, the local authorities. But that wasn't enough. To study those cases, to reveal those cases, I needed to turn them into issues. What does this tell us? If we're going to contribute anything as social analysts, as political analysts, what does this tell us about the state of play in the society in which we live? So that's where the notion of marginalisation underpinning my work came from. The Liverpool Travellers Free School, policing Merseyside and being involved in the analysis of the inner city uprisings, the incarceration of those people I worked with and the politics of confinement, the Glenuckle custody deaths 1981 to 1984, and the Peterhead prison uprising, both of which I worked on with Joe Sim. Deaths in state custody, a founding member of Inquest, Campaigns for Justice, then moving on to contested inquests, or fatal accident inquiries in Scotland, and the rights of the bereaved. And that led me to Stardust in Ireland, which has only just recently been resolved. Lockerbie, Marchioness, Dunblane, Grenfell, working with those families, and of course Hillsborough. And the Hillsborough Independent Panel reports, the Hillsborough Independent reports that I wrote in 1990 and 1985, and then the Independent Panel in 2012. Moving to Ireland and the legacy of the Northern Ireland conflict, the current work on childhood transition in a state of conflict, and mother and baby institutions, Magdalene laundries, workhouses. So none of this, go back for me, these. None of this would mean anything without the voices. And of course I could be here all night, and I won't be. But this was Kira. The night I tried to hang myself, the voices tell me to do them. And I realized the pain as well. It's terrible, so it is. Just look at what they make me go to the toilet in. And she pointed to a cardboard potty in the corner of the room. They don't give me underwear or nothing. She was wearing a canvas gown. Sleeves ended here. It went down to just above her knees. And the time I was with her in her cell with Linda Moore, and I asked her if that made her uncomfortable, I would leave and leave her with Linda, and she said no. She wanted me to stay. They just give you a wee sanitary towel, and that's it. That was in answer to a question, what do you do when you're on your period? She had to trap a sanitary towel between her legs. No support, nothing. Your dignity is taken away. They just said it's your own fault, you're behind the door. She was a brilliant artist. And we worked with her while she was in prison in terms of, when I say worked with her, worked alongside her while she was in prison. She came out and was making a really solid life. And then, tragically, at 29, cancer took her. Annie, I didn't know Annie, but I knew her family. She died while we were doing the work in the women's prison in Northern Ireland. At the end of the day, I know that if anything happens to me, there'll be an investigation. She says, I never ripped the mattress or blankets, nor did I block the spy. So if I take pneumonia, and this is her spelling, it'll all come out. I think you'll only last 10 or 12 days without drinking, because then you dehydrate and your kidneys go. I've no intention of eating or drinking again. So they're beat there. I know they'd all love me dead, but I'll make sure everything is revealed first. She died, and it became our objective, Linda and myself, to see that the context in which she died was revealed. And then there's Eddie, who was on the terraces with his son Adam at Hillsborough. And when the crowd outside became so overwhelming, he stood back. He didn't feel he should go in. And then they opened the exit gates to let people in quickly. And they went in down a 1 in 6 gradient tunnel into the back of already crowded pens. And they stood there on the pen, and the crush came. Like a vice getting tighter and tighter. I turned Adam around to me in distress. There was a police officer on the track about 5 or 6 feet away. There was a perimeter fence, and in each pen had a small gate in front of it, which was locked. I begged him to open the gate, screaming, my lovely son is dying, begging him to help. He just stood and looked at me. I punched the fence right at the beginning when I was begging the officer to open the gate. I could have got Adam out. I know, because I was there. And both were left for dead. And suddenly, after half an hour, the realization that Eddie was twitching, although his son had died. And Eddie was left partially paralyzed in his hands as a consequence, and he's since died. Became a very close friend. Very articulate guy. And people say, well, they were in pens. How come they crushed it? No. They were directed into 2 central pens with railings at either side and railings at the front, each supposed to house between 1,000 and 1,500 people. And we now have the technology to do the count. Over 3,000 people were in those pens. And they were directed there down that tunnel by the police. And they couldn't get back out because more people were coming down the tunnel. And people coming down the tunnel couldn't see what was happening at the front because it was a tunnel with a gradient. And then there's Mick, who was a senior lecturer at Stirling University and who had fairly recently, 6 months before Dunblane, his wife had died. And you all know the story of, or you know some of the story of Dunblane. Man arrives with a gun, Thomas Hamilton, shoots children and teacher. This is the afternoon of Dunblane, hours after it had happened, after they'd been sat on buses outside waiting to go in to meet the police, not knowing what had happened to any of their children. We were taken into the staff room. Some parents' names were being called out. Those of us left behind thought, well, it's probably their children who've been killed, hoping that theirs hadn't. We weren't told anything. The police behaviour was atrocious, as if we were an inconvenience. Eventually we went in. He started talking, knew nothing about my family situation. He said to Mick and the woman he was with, Mr. and Mrs. North. Mrs. North had died 6 months earlier. This was a close family friend who had gone with him. I stopped him and said, I'm a single parent, and this is my friend who has stayed with me. A man of immense dignity who's been behind the gun control campaign in Scotland and internationally. He was with us just 3 weeks ago in Belfast. And then the final one I want to talk about is the more recent work that I've been doing. Trying to imagine this woman's plight as a man. On my knees, 8 months pregnant, scrubbing a clean floor. Scrubbing a clean floor. Holding my belly with one hand, the brush with the other, the nun standing over me. A few days after she was born, her daughter, they told me to dress her and gave me new clothes. Then they took her. She was gone. I lay there at the empty cot, holding a blanket to my face. I have lived with this silently all my life, and I have felt that I have carried a heavy, guilty burden. And that most recent work, particularly with the women whose children were taken, but with those who were children who were taken, men and women, has been the most recent defining area of my work. These adverts are taken from the newspapers, from the Adoption Society. For adoption, lovely boy, 5 years old, David, etc., etc. So, going back to Susan Sontag, where I started, and her work regarding the pain of others, you can see that that quote of what do we do with knowledge of faraway suffering, it seems to ignore the ordeals of others. We can't imagine. But Susan Sontag goes on to say, perhaps the only people with the right to look at the images of suffering of this extreme order are those who can do something to alleviate it. If ever there was a clarion call to those of us who do that work, Susan Sontag delivered it. Because we're surrounded by the view from above, and you in this room don't need me to spell all this out. The relationships between power, authority, and how that power and authority is legitimated, and the official discourse that supports it, hits us between the eyes every single day of the week. But what about the view from below? About bearing witness, about gathering testimonies, about recovering truth. Oh, I know there'll be a debate about the relativism of truth. I've heard it all. But I know truth when I see it. I know truth when I see the refusal, the steadfast refusal of that police officer to open the gate when he could have got people out. and to challenge the deceit of official discourse. And most of all, to return to C. Wright Mills and to turn those personal troubles into public issues. What this is about is contextualizing personal experiences, lived histories, social and cultural circumstances. It's about being there and bearing witness, but it has ethical challenges. Don McCullin, the great journalist, raised these issues. He said, such research requires being there or bearing witness, and occasionally takes the researcher to a different place. When do you put down the camera, he said, as a cameraman, and do something? He was talking about Biafra at the time. When do you put down the camera? Metaphorically, when do we put down our cameras and do something? And that led me into when do you pause as a researcher or as a social worker or as a teacher or anybody else with social responsibility and intervene? When do we give evidence or expose what is happening before it is too late? What I concluded was researching the suffering of others is in contested circumstances through institutional negligence and interpersonal violence presents political as well as methodological and ethical challenges. And it's being up for that. It's being up for those ethical challenges. I don't know how many reports I've seen assessing applications that I've made for funding that actually questions the methodological and ethical legitimacy of what it is I'm doing. It just makes me more determined. Not because I think that I have some gift for being right, but because I understand where the academy is coming from in ring-fencing the potential of really critical work. So this leads me into those interrelated notions of knowing that I've been talking about, intervening that I've been talking about, but also memorializing, foregrounding survivors' and relatives' testimonies. Oh, say people, they're so subjective. Are you serious? You mean people don't actually remember their suffering? Accessing and archiving records and ensuring in the work I'm doing currently that survivors and relatives have open access to those records that are held by the state and other institutions, including religious institutions. Investigating the human rights violations that underpin institutional practices. We talk about human rights as if there's an agreed agenda of human rights. But human rights violations are something that we have to define in terms of what we consider of the rights of humanity and how those rights are then violated by practices that are supposedly supporting and yet are often damaging those who suffer the most. And in doing this, holding state and non-state institutions and individuals involved in those institutions to account. As I, with Dina Hayden, have written, securing rights and justice requires a fundamental shift in structural relations and what I call the determining contexts of power. When people would say sometimes about my work that your approach is is structurally determinist, I would say, what do you mean by that? They say, well, you take a position. And I would say, are you trying to tell me that the way power manifests itself is not governed by determining contexts, parameters, institutional, intellectual? Because those determining contexts are so significant in marginalizing and excluding those with the most to lose and gain to marginalise and exclude them from effective participation in their own struggles. So where does this leave me in terms of critical social research? Well, it comes as no surprise that I see critical social research as being primarily driven by disclosure. The context of that disclosure, as I've already illustrated, is understanding the moments, the events, the responses within their structural determinants. More than that, it's about, as C. Wright Mills put it, as I've already mentioned, personal troubles being contextualized and explained in the structural relations of social and historical conditions. It's our duty to understand those social and historical conditions, not take them at face value, but to research them as part of our work. You'll find this amazing, but our Vice-Chancellor, the last Vice-Chancellor, decided in his infinite wisdom that he was going to amalgamate the history department with a view to closing it down in terms of its individual integrity. Because he didn't see the relevance of history to the contemporary university. Now, I don't know about you guys, that took my breath away. I was surprised when we opposed it, how few senior academics stood alongside us in that opposition. And it was defeated. But the very fact that he thought it, the very fact that he wanted to engineer that to happen, really explained to me that he wouldn't be able to understand C. Wright Mills' notion of where our personal troubles are rooted, both personally in history, but also structurally and socially in history. And I'm quoting from Stan Cohen and C. Wright Mills, long-established academic writers, because I can't improve on their words. I mean, Stan Cohen, when he came, and there's so much he's written on this, when he came about this idea of troubling recognitions, the issues of profound concern, I interpret it as being denied or neutralized or reconstructed. So it's the critical researcher's responsibility to uncover, disclose, and disseminate troubling information. At the heart of our work is investigation. The objective is revelation. And the longer-term objective is to create and stand over an alternative discourse that challenges the structural, political material that we're fed on a daily basis. So I'm paying my dues here. Niels Christie, a good friend who has died quite a while ago again, why should I try and dress this up in my own words when he said it far better than I could? Acts are not, they become. So it is with crime. And we can use crime as a metaphor for anything, any act, any form of act. Crime does not exist. It is created. Because he goes on to say, first there are acts. Then follows a long process of giving meaning to those acts. And to couple that with going back to Howard Becker's statement on acts earlier, he argues that the deviant character that is constructed is the way in which it becomes defined in the public mind, which is what I've been attempting to develop in this. Central to this process, then, are the ideological underpinning constructions that underpin the meaning of everyday life. These are not simply personal or social, but they are profoundly, deeply institutionalized. They're all around us. They're in these very buildings. So I'm going back to where I began, contextualizing marginalization. Start with the very simple proposition that we have to work on the structural relations of inequality, and they're there. Wealth, racism, sectarianism, patriarchy, age and ageism, adultism. Each instance of impoverishment, sexism, homophobia, racism, sectarianism, and yes, I use the phrase child hate because there isn't another word or two words that better summarize it, as an expression of agency, has its particular circumstances and its lived history. Yet they cannot be researched, analysed and fully comprehended without locating them in the determining contexts of structure. So, social justice, inclusion and rights, they trip off our tongues. But they are meaningless unless they have an agenda that we can work to. What does that agenda look like? Well, to me, it's obvious, and I'm sure when I say it, it's obvious to everybody in the room. You can't have an inclusive society where poverty exists. A third of children in the north of Ireland live in poverty, and by that I mean below the breadline. Securing essential services to support those communities. Ensuring access to information and building into neighbourhoods that support to be able to mobilise that information. Creating effective means of state-community relations and consultation. I wish I had £1 for every consultative document, especially in the north of Ireland, that comes through my door, asking me to participate in consultation. But how comes it comes to me? How come there's not active consultation in the communities around me? Because the inclusive, active participation of all community voices is essential. That is the only way that will lead to celebrate diversity, challenge discrimination, and more than anything else, particularly in the society in which I live, the fear that underpins the other. And we have to, in all of this, respond to mental well-being, not as either you're well or you're ill, but as a continuum. I know for a fact, I know from a personal fact, I've been on that continuum. I've felt that continuum. And I know what it did to me. And to be determined to come off that continuum without the help of drugs was difficult, particularly with 2 young children. And I don't often talk about my own experiences in that way, but it really helped me to understand at that time, as a single parent, to help me understand at that time what others around me were going through. And then a quick walk around the Ormeau Park, and to use a well-known Irish phrase, catch yourself on, think this through. You've got responsibilities. But fortunately, I also had the material position to be able to come through that. I also had the support of others to come through that. And it's in this context that we create hope through material opportunity. And I won't have it when people say to me, oh, Phil, you talk about hope. It's such a relative concept. I mean, what do you mean, hope? When you're in a community which is hopeless, where people feel hopeless, you know that that hopelessness has to be directly contested by the creation of hope. And the way that is done is through material opportunity. Valuing people, valuing what they do, and promoting our critical thought through action and dialogue. But to do this, the rights that strip so easily off people's tongues, that are economic, social and cultural, have to be secured. And in this, the public intellectual has a role. Edward Said said, "We have to reject careful silence, patriotic bluster, and retrospective self-dramatizing apostasy, and to challenge patriotic nationalism, corporate thinking, and a sense of class, racial or gender privilege." I don't want to put words in his mouth. He is obviously now dead, but I will. That is about developing a comprehensive historical, political, economic, social, legal analysis, an integrated analysis, and to record the immediate circumstances and aftermath of any given event. I've talked about some of those, and the experiences of individuals, community, and the impact of media coverage. To engage with investigations and inquiries, to establish liability, to not fight shy of that, to reveal the institutional tensions that underpin those investigations and inquiries, and the self-serving nature in which they're set up, and the organisation's best interests. The monitoring of state investigations is crucial because people in everyday life have neither the time nor the capacity to participate fully. We have. And to bring communities into that discourse. So the public participation and community engagement are two sides of the same coin. Why try and sum it up when Ariel Dorfman did it in 3 very short paragraphs? He was obviously talking about the disappeared. They found a way of speaking out, the men and women whose voices have now reached us, decided that they could not live with themselves if they did nothing. They could not stain their lives by remaining silent. They understood that if they witnessed this suffering inflicted on themselves or on others and did nothing, they were, in some twisted way, being turned into accomplices. And they had to face the long nights when it seemed nobody cared, when the darkness of apathy seemed to surround them, when their voices did not seem to receive the echo and the answer that they needed. If I was to sum up in a few words the role of the critical social researcher, the role of the critical political researcher, it is about the pursuit of that echo and that answer, and the way in which that echo and that answer ripples through our communities and challenges the seats of power that determine and debilitate those who live in those communities. That's the job of the critical social researcher. Thanks for listening.